It started with the feeling that the silence wasn't empty, but full. I was home alone for the first time in years. My parents had gone on a weekend trip to visit a sick relative, leaving me, a 23-year-old, with a full-time desk job, in charge of a house that had been my entire world since I was a child. The first night, a Friday, was blissful. I ordered a pizza, played video games until my eyes blurred, and enjoyed the freedom of not having to tiptoe around. The house, an old 2-story colonial with creaky floorboards and temperamental plumbing, was a familiar friend. Every groan of the heating system, every tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, knew them all. They were the comforting soundtrack to my life. But that second night, a Saturday, the soundtrack changed. I was scrolling through my phone in the living room when I heard a sound from outside, not a branch scraping the window, not an animal. It was a single, soft rap on the glass of the kitchen window, sharp and distinct, like a knuckle. I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen. It was too soft to be a prank, too deliberate to be accidental. It was just one knock, then nothing. A wave of cold washed over me, a feeling of being observed, and I pulled the curtains shut, telling myself it was nothing, just a trick of the old house. That feeling, that subtle shift from comfort to unease, was the beginning of everything. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that the suburban sprawl was hardly a hotbed for home invasions. And besides, I was a light sleeper. The hours passed, and I managed to get my mind off it by focusing on the mundane. I went to the kitchen to get a drink of water. The tap squeaked, and the sound echoed unnaturally in the quiet. I turned on the light and glanced at the window. The curtains still drawn. A chill ran down my spine. The single knock had felt like a question, and now the silence felt like the space where I was supposed to provide an answer. But I had nothing to say. I finished my drink and made my way upstairs. As I passed the master bedroom, which was my parents' room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier that day when I was tidying up. I always closed it. It was just a habit. I told myself a gust of wind from an open window had pushed it, but all the windows were shut tight. I reached out and pushed the door firmly closed, the click of the latch echoing in the silent hallway. I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, listening to the house breathe. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Below, a faint, constant tone. And then, woven into that familiar hum, was a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Not the single knock from before, but a slow, steady tap-tap, coming from what sounded like the other side of the house, where the guest room was. It was too quiet to be certain, almost lost in the background noise, but it was there, and it was persistent. I finally got up, heart pounding. My parents had told me to check on a few things before they left, including the old boiler in the basement. I'd been putting it off. Maybe it was a pipe. I crept out of my room, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet. I made my way to the guest room and pressed my ear to the door. The tapping was gone. Just silence. It was then I saw it. On the carpet, just outside the closed door, was a single, small, brown leaf. We lived in a neighborhood with no trees that dropped those kind of leaves. There was no explanation for it being there, especially not when the house was sealed up. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. The tapping began again, this time from the hallway behind me. It was quick, insistent, and seemed to be moving. My breath caught in my throat. I turned and saw nothing but the long, dark hallway. The tapping stopped. I ran back into my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I leaned against it, my eyes scanning the room as if something was already in here with me. It was irrational, I knew, but every shadow felt like a waiting shape. I stayed there for what felt like an hour, my body a coiled spring of tension, before I heard it again. This time it was distinct and terrifyingly close. It was a scratching sound, coming from inside my closet. A slow, deliberate scraping of something sharp against wood. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was a methodical, almost artistic scraping, like a claw drawing lines on the back of the closet door. I could hear my own heart thudding in my ears, and the sound was so loud it drowned out everything else. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and grabbed my phone. I dialed 911, my voice a strangled whisper as I tried to explain what was happening. I was huddled in the far corner of my room, holding the phone tightly against my ear, listening to the dispatcher's calm voice. The scratching had stopped. The house was silent again, a deep, heavy quiet that was worse than the noise. The dispatcher was telling me to stay calm, that an officer was on the way. I heard something from the other side of my bedroom door. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling. The feeling of something breathing. It was a soft, wet inhalation and exhalation, just on the other side of the door. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, silently. It twisted to the left, a little at a time, until I heard the faint click of the lock disengaging. I stared, transfixed, at the knob as it began to turn back. There was a pause. The breathing stopped. Then, a voice, a whisper that was not a whisper, but a breathy, distorted, wet sound that came from right outside the door, right where I knew something was. It was a low, inhuman rattle, and it said my name, not in a question, not in a greeting. It was a statement. Just my name, drawn out, and wrong. It was the sound of something knowing me. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. They found nothing. No footprints in the grass. No signs of forced entry. The scratches on the inside of my closet door were gone. They checked the whole house, finding everything in its place. The guest room door was firmly closed. The master bedroom door was also shut. The officer looked at me with an expression of polite skepticism, suggesting it was probably just my imagination running wild in a big, old house. I didn't try to explain the whisper. I didn't tell him that the scratches had been on the inside of the closet. I moved out of that house a month later. I told my parents it was for a change of scenery. I still jump at every unusual sound and sleep with a lamp on, no matter how tired I am. But what keeps me up at night isn't the memory of the tapping, or the scratches, or even the feeling of being watched. It's the thought that whatever was in that house didn't just want to scare me. It wanted me to know that it knew who I was. It wanted me to know that it had my name. The worst thing about true isolation isn't the loneliness. It's the realization that you're not supposed to be alone. I've spent the last 6 years as a solo technician at a remote meteorological station in the Alaskan tundra. A tiny outpost surrounded by nothing but snow and sky. My shifts last for 2 weeks at a time, and the solitude is the main perk of the job. I love the silence, the vast, white emptiness that stretches to the horizon, the feeling of being the only human for 100 miles. My only constant companions are the wind and the static from the long-range radio. It was a cold, clear night, the kind where the stars burn with an impossible intensity, and I was making my final log entries. The radio, which usually only carried the occasional clipped report from another station, or the distant, garbled music of a faraway channel, was silent. Then, a low hum bled through the static. Not the usual white noise. It sounded like a voice, stretched thin and distorted, but there was a rhythm to it. I leaned closer, adjusting the dial. It wasn't a weather report or a message. It was a single, repetitive sound, and I swear, through the static and the hum, I could make out my name. It was just a whisper, a breathy sound that came and went. John, John, John. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was gone, swallowed by the static again. My blood ran cold, but I shook it off. This was my 6th year. I knew all about atmospheric interference, strange signals, and the way the cold played tricks on the electronics. I told myself it was just a strange frequency. It was a technical glitch. It was nothing. But my hand stayed on the dial, and I couldn't stop listening. The feeling of nothing didn't last. A few hours after the first incident, the weather took a turn. A storm was coming in, a real whiteout that would keep me isolated for at least another few days. The wind began to howl, a deep, mournful sound that rattled the reinforced windows. I was preparing to hunker down when the radio hummed to life again. This time, it wasn't my name. It was a strange, rhythmic chant. It was low, guttural, and sounded like a language I'd never heard before. But it was being spoken right there, in the small warm room with me. I turned the volume down until it was a faint whisper, but I couldn't turn it off. I was transfixed, listening to the strange alien words being carried on the airwaves, all while the wind screamed outside. I tried to use the satellite phone to call my supervisor, to report the strange interference, but all I got was a constant, flat tone. The line was dead. I looked at the station's external cameras, the ones that monitored the perimeter. The camera feed showed the swirling snow, the darkness, the endless white nothing. Then, for a split second, a flicker, a shape moved across the top right corner of the frame. It was fast, almost too fast to see. I rewound the feed, frame by frame, but it was gone. Just a blur, a smudge in the pixelated snow. I told myself it was a gust of wind, a piece of debris, or a malfunctioning camera. But then the feed flickered again. This time, it was a shadow, long and thin, that passed over the lens. It was moving too fast to be human, and too unnatural to be a known animal. There are no trees out here, no poles tall enough to cast a shadow. Like that. I sat there for hours, watching the cameras, my heart pounding in my chest. The chants from the radio continued, growing louder and more insistent. It felt like they were getting closer, the voices weaving a web of sound around the station, around me. The thought that whatever was broadcasting these sounds wasn't just a signal, but something that was out there in the cold, something that was aware of me, began to take hold. I saw another flicker on the camera feed, and this time, my rationale, mine broke. I ran to the main control panel and manually cut the feed to the cameras. The silence from the radio was a relief, but the deep, howling wind that rushed in to fill the void was even worse. The sense of being watched from the vast, white emptiness outside was now a tangible pressure against the walls. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the horizon, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening. Through the swirling snow, I saw it, a shape, standing motionless on a distant ridge. It was tall and impossibly thin, a silhouette that seemed to absorb the light. It wasn't a rock, because it was too regular, too symmetrical. And it wasn't a human, because of the way its limbs bent at impossible angles, like shattered glass. I watched it for what felt like an eternity, and it never moved. It just stood there, a still, black monument, against the storm, facing me. It was looking right at me. The blizzard was at its peak. The entire station was shaking under the force of the wind, and the windows were caked in ice. I had abandoned the binoculars, and I was huddled in the kitchen, a hot cup of coffee my only source of warmth. My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation. The figure on the ridge, the radio chants, the dead communication lines. It had to be a hallucination. The isolation was finally getting to me. Then, a low thud came from the opposite side of the station, from the reinforced window that faced north. I froze. It was a single, heavy thud, like a large body hitting the glass. I crept over to the window, my legs heavy with dread. I wiped the ice from the corner of the glass and peered out into the white vortex of the storm. Nothing, just swirling, snow and darkness. I sighed in relief, the release of tension leaving me weak. And then, another thud. This one came from the window I was just at. I spun around, my heart in my throat. I pressed my face to the glass, and through the swirling chaos, I saw it. The figure from the ridge. It was standing right outside the window, not 5 feet away. It was tall, thin, and its arms hung by its sides, bending in ways that no human arms should bend. Its head was small, and it had no discernible features, just a blackness against the white, and it was staring right at me, right at my face, through the glass. The wind was screaming, a sound that filled the world, but somehow I heard something else, a whisper, not from the radio, not from the wind. It was coming from a place beyond sound, a place deep in my mind, and it was saying the same thing the radio had been trying to tell me all along. "You're not alone," it said. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the thing outside my window, but it was gone when the storm finally broke. The rescue team arrived the next morning. They found me in a state of catatonic shock, wrapped in a blanket in a corner, my coffee long since gone cold. They wrote it off as cabin fever and the mental toll of extreme isolation. I never went back to that job. I live in a city now, surrounded by people and noise and light. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, late at night, I'll turn on the TV, and when the static comes on, I'll listen. And sometimes, buried in the low white noise, I'll hear it again. That low, rhythmic sound, that voice that knows my name. And I'll remember the thing that was standing outside my window, just waiting for the static to clear. Taps on the wall. I waited, my breath held. The tapping from my neighbor's side immediately stopped. The scraping, however, grew louder, more violent. It was moving up the wall, a slow, methodical climbing sound, punctuated by a series of low, wet thuds. The sound was so close that it felt like it was inside my own room. It was not a conversation I wanted to be a part of. The scraping continued for what felt like an eternity, tracing a path along the wall, directly above my head. It stopped just above my bed, and for the first time, I heard another sound. It was a soft, guttural sniffing, followed by a faint clicking noise, like a tongue against the roof of a mouth. The wall, old and frail, was no longer a barrier. It was a membrane. I spent the next night in my bed, a blanket pulled over my head, too afraid to move. The scraping was still there, but it was now a low, persistent gnawing, right above me, a constant reminder of what was lurking on the other side. My neighbor's tapping had completely ceased. The silence from his apartment was now a terrifying void. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the tapping had been a desperate attempt to warn me, and that it had failed. The gnawing stopped. I held my breath, listening to the deep, heavy silence of the apartment. I heard a soft rustling sound from the corner of my room, near an old painted-over air vent. It was a small oblong vent that had been sealed shut with several layers of paint. A low, wet sucking sound followed the rustling, and then the painted vent cover began to move. Slowly, with an unnerving creak, it began to be pushed outwards, the brittle paint cracking and flaking away. A long, thin, unnaturally pale finger emerged from the opening. It was followed by another, and then another, each one pale and thin and bending at odd, impossible joints. The fingers felt around the rim of the vent, testing the air, and then they slowly began to pull themselves out, their knuckles clicking and popping with a sickening sound. The tapping had been the neighbor trying to warn me. The scratching had been the thing in my walls. The silence from his apartment was because it was no longer on the other side of the wall. It was now in my room. I left the apartment that night, without looking back. I told the landlord that I was moving out and never gave a reason. I tried to find my neighbor, to thank him, to apologize for not listening, but his apartment was empty. The landlord told me that the previous tenant had moved out a month ago, and the unit had been vacant ever since. My skin still crawls when I think about it. I now live in a modern building with thick, concrete walls, but I still can't shake the feeling. I sleep with the lights on, the television blaring, and the sound of my phone or the radio always there, to cover the silence. I am forever listening for a pattern, a message in the noise. I'm waiting for the tapping. I'm afraid to find out what happens when the tapping stops and the scratching begins again. I've always been a creature of the night. My job as a freelance graphic designer meant my hours were my own, and I found the deep quiet of 2 a.m. to be the most productive time. My apartment was a cheap, drafty one-bedroom in an old brick building, but it had large windows, and the rent was low. The thin walls were a given, a trade-off I made for the peace I sought. For the first year, I considered my neighbor a quiet man I only ever saw in passing, a silent partner in this nocturnal existence. I would hear the distant hum of his television, the muffled thump of his footsteps, and it was a comfort, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in the world. The sounds of life from the other side of the shared wall were a familiar, calming presence. But that changed on one particularly quiet Tuesday night. I was focused on a project, the only sound in the room being the soft click of my mouse, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap tap, pause, tap tap. It came from the other side of the wall, from my neighbor's apartment. It wasn't loud, just a persistent, almost polite sound. I figured he was building something or hanging a picture late at night. I didn't think much of it at the time, just made a mental note of the new, late-night noise. That was my first mistake. My second was listening for it the next night. The tapping came again the following evening, but it was different. It wasn't the sound of someone working. It was a complex, almost melodic pattern. 3 fast taps, a pause, 2 slow ones. It was insistent, like a code. My own work, which had been so easy to get lost in, was now completely forgotten. My ears were pressed to the thin wall, my mind trying to make sense of the new rhythm. The tapping went on for about 15 minutes, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and unnerving. I was about to go back to my work when I heard a new sound, coming from my side of the wall. It was a low, scraping sound, a soft skr-skr, as if someone were running a fingernail along the inside of the plaster. It came from the corner where my bookshelf was, right where the wall met the floor. I pulled the bookshelf away, but there was nothing there, just the old, peeling wallpaper and a thin baseboard. The scraping stopped. I stood there, utterly confused, my heart thumping against my ribs. I knew the building was old, but these noises were new, specific, and seemingly responsive. The next few nights, the patterns escalated. The tapping from my neighbor's side of the wall became more frantic, more erratic. It was no longer a code. It was a desperate plea. The scraping from my side of the wall became more aggressive, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to be directly answering the tapping. It was a conversation, I realized. The tapping and the scratching were communicating. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I could feel the tone of the exchange. The tapping was a warning, a frantic shout. The scraping was a slow, deliberate, and terrifying response. I was losing sleep. My work was piling up. I was spending all my nights with my ear pressed to the wall, trying to decipher the message, trying to understand what my neighbor was so desperately trying to tell me. One night, in a fit of paranoia, I tapped back. Just 3 slow,